Hello, physiologists. Let's discuss hemodynamics and blood pressure regulation. When we talk about hemodynamics, those are just different variables that will affect your blood flow. And by blood flow, I mean how much blood is flowing through a particular area of your body in a period of time. So volume of blood through an organ, for example, in a given period of time. Your total blood flow is the same as your cardiac output. You may remember that cardiac output is calculated by your heart rate times your stroke volume, how much blood is ejected out of one ventricle at a time. So all of the blood that circulates through your systemic or your pulmonary blood vessels each minute is your cardiac output, and that's directly related to your total blood flow that's flowing in your body. Distribution of that cardiac output can change. It can change regionally, depending on the needs of your body. It is affected by pressure differences because blood will always move from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure, and also by resistance. And by resistance, we often mean friction. What is going to keep that blood from moving effectively? What's going to stop that blood from moving and flowing freely? So things that can affect resistance, things that will oppose blood flow. Vessel diameter. So if we look at this picture is demonstrating laminar flow, or that blood flows in layers. You can see in this larger diameter vessel, in the center, blood is moving the most freely and the most quickly, and that is due in part because it's not touching the walls of this vessel. There's plenty of space in the middle, and blood can move freely. Notice that these regions that are touching the walls of the vessel are encountering more friction and are therefore traveling more slowly. So blood in the middle tends to travel the fastest, and if you have a larger diameter vessel, then you have much more space in order to move. Compared to this smaller diameter vessel, the walls are closing in around you, so to speak, and there is less space in the middle for free movement to just flow straight down the middle. And so you have more of your blood, a higher proportion of your blood, that's encountering friction because it keeps rubbing against the sides of the vessel. So the larger the diameter, the less resistance. The smaller the diameter of your blood vessel, more resistance. Blood viscosity can also affect resistance, and blood is normally about 4 to 5 times thicker than water, and that is due to red blood cells and plasma proteins for the most part. If you increase the amount of erythrocytes, if you increase how many plasma proteins you have, then that will also increase your blood viscosity, make it thicker, more syrupy, and that thicker fluid is going to flow through your vessels with more difficulty. Again, you're going to encounter more friction. Total blood vessel length also contributes to resistance. The longer the blood vessel, the higher the resistance. And this is again because of friction. So if you are traveling down a vessel that is longer, you have more opportunity for that blood to rub up against the blood vessel walls compared to a shorter vessel where you'll get to the end a little bit quicker and there's less opportunity for that blood to be moving against the blood vessel walls. One of the reasons why obesity is tied to hypertension is because for every 2.2 pounds of fat, for every kilogram of fat, you generate 400 miles of additional blood vessels. And that increased length in your blood vessels increases resistance. And if you get too much resistance, then that can increase your blood pressure. So this equation helps to kind of relate those factors. So F is for flow, total flow is your cardiac output. And you can see it is directly proportional to delta P, which is the change in pressure. We talked about how blood moves from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure. So if you have a pretty drastic change in pressure, so if you're moving from a very high pressure area to a very low pressure area, then that will promote more flow than if you're moving from an area of slightly higher pressure to a slightly lower pressure. You'll still have flow, but that flow is going to be a little bit decreased. Flow is also indirectly proportional to resistance. So as resistance goes up, flow goes down. As resistance goes down, flow goes up. And this is opposition to blood flow. And that's due to the factors that we just discussed. Increased viscosity, increased vessel length, decreased blood vessel diameter, and that increases resistance. And you can have some substantial changes to your blood vessel diameter due to vasoconstriction and vasodilation. You've got plenty of smooth muscle, especially in your arteries and arterioles, and sympathetic, parasympathetic, and hormonal stimulation can affect that blood vessel diameter through varying mechanisms. So there are a lot of ways where you can adjust your vessel diameter, and so that is the most important variable. You've got resistance to consider when you're thinking about blood flow through your vessels. What exactly is blood pressure? It's how much that blood is pushing against your vessel wall. And we usually measure this with a sphygmomanometer, either an automatic one or a manual one. We'll close off your brachial artery and then allow blood back into it, and we'll measure how much that blood vessel stretches. So as that blood vessel stretches to the sides, in order to accommodate that blood flowing through the vessel, we measure how much pressure that is, and that's your systolic pressure. We also want to measure how much pressure is exerted against your blood vessel wall when the vessel has recoiled back to its at rest state. And you may notice that these names, you have systolic pressure, which is the stretch on your blood vessels. You have diastolic pressure, which is the recoil of your blood vessels. And we measure those pressures. You may notice that they sound a whole lot like systole and diastole. And you are correct. Systolic pressure is how much pressure is exerted on your blood vessel when your heart is working, when it's contracting, when it's in systole. And this recoil, the diastolic pressure, is the pressure exerted on your blood vessels when your heart is at rest. And so when you've probably heard about the 160 over 80 measurements, or 120 over 80 measurements, Systolic pressure is the first number that's listed, and then the bottom number is the diastolic pressure that's measured. And so you look at both of those measurements, but generally the diastolic measure is considered a little bit more important because your heart, of course, you're going to have more stretch in your vessels when your heart is working, when it's in systole, so you would expect your systolic pressure to be pretty high. But if you're still having a really high diastolic pressure when your heart is at rest, then that may indicate more of a problem. And your blood pressure depends on a variety of factors. What's your cardiac output? How much is your blood volume? And what is the resistance that you're facing? As you're looking at your blood pressure through different vessels in your body, you can see, at least initially, it's quite pulsatile. And so as you're coming out of the left ventricle and into the aorta, you can see it changes pretty drastically. So you have some pretty big changes. So here's ventricular ejection as all that blood is pushed into the aorta, it stretches, and then it recoils. The aorta recoils and pushes that blood onward, and it kind of empties out a little bit. So you have some pretty drastic changes in the aorta and those initial arteries branching off of the aorta. But the farther you get from the heart, the more it kind of equals out, and you don't see that pulsing so much anymore. And then you can see this top area right here, this top bar, the highest level is the systolic pressure. So that's what's happening when your heart is in systole, how much pressure is exerted on your vessels, and then diastolic pressure down here. When we're looking at blood pressure, we take both of these measurements into account, the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure. And so if you need one number to look at your arterial pressure, we look at mean arterial pressure. And so this takes into account both systolic and diastolic pressure. And you actually, if you look at the equation for mean arterial pressure, you end up adding 2 diastolic pressures in for every one of the systolic pressure measurements you add in. And that is because at rest, the heart spends about twice as much time in diastole as systole. And so your mean arterial pressure measurement will be more accurate if you take 2 diastolic measurements. But since we take our blood pressure, we measure at arteries, we do need to take both of those different measurements into account. You can see how different they are. And then the farther you move away from the heart, blood pressure decreases quite a lot. And by the time you end up in the vena cava, before you head back into the right atrium, you're almost at 0. As I said before, your mean arterial pressure takes into account that extra diastolic pressure because of the extra time spent in diastole. Pulse pressure is your systolic pressure minus your diastolic pressure. So you're basically looking at how hard your heart is working. What is the difference in the pressure of your blood vessels between systole and diastole? How much force is your heart using? Blood pressure homeostasis is really important to maintain because if it's too low, you're not going to send enough blood to your tissues, you're not going to deliver oxygen effectively, you're not going to pick up wastes effectively, and so you're at risk for ischemia, which is lack of oxygen, and necrosis, death of your tissues. If your blood pressure is too high, then you can damage your blood vessels. You're at risk for aneurysms, like you can see in the picture here, and other damage to your blood vessels. So regulating your blood pressure is very important in your body. And there are different ways that this is accomplished. You have lots of different feedback mechanisms. Help make sure that your cardiac output, your blood volume, your vascular resistance overall are within normal levels. Some ways act faster than others, so neural mechanisms, reflexes, those are going to act very quickly. And then different ones act for a short term and some act for a longer term. Longer term would be, for example, hormones tend to act on a broader area and more long term. So we'll talk about some of these different mechanisms: neural, hormonal, and then finally autoregulation. All of these are controlled and monitored by the cardiovascular center in your medulla oblongata. So your cardiovascular center gets input from all over the place. You get input from your cerebral cortex, limbic system, hypothalamus. Before you even get on a treadmill, you're thinking about getting a treadmill. You're thinking about exercising, and your cardiovascular center will start to get ready for that. Proprioceptors that monitor joint movements. If you start moving your joints around, if you start getting on that treadmill, if you start exercising, that information goes to your cardiovascular center. As blood pressure increases or decreases, your baroreceptors located in your carotid arteries and also your aorta will send that information to your cardiovascular center. And then also chemoreceptors that monitor your blood carbon dioxide levels, pH, and oxygen levels. That information also goes to the cardiovascular center. So you have a lot of information to sort through in the cardiovascular center located in the medulla. Once the cardiovascular center gets all of that information, it can determine what needs to be done. If overall you have blood pressure that is too high, so for example, your baroreceptors keep getting stretched more and more, they're stretched very often, those action potentials get sent very quickly. Cardiovascular center determines we need to bring our blood pressure down. And so you're going to send parasympathetic output through your vagus nerves, and it will cause your heart to decrease heart rate. Remember, heart rate is a factor in cardiac output, and cardiac output is total blood flow. So decreasing your heart rate will bring down your blood pressure. If your blood pressure is too low and you are not getting adequate perfusion of your tissues, if you are generating too much carbon dioxide and you're not getting enough oxygen delivery, then that will tell the cardiovascular center that you need to raise your blood pressure. Cardiovascular center will send out sympathetic output. You can affect the heart, increase heart rate, increase contractility of the heart. You can also affect blood vessels, vasoconstriction. And you'll notice there's no parasympathetic output for your blood vessels. And that is because while most of your tissues have dual innervation that have both parasympathetic and sympathetic fibers, your blood vessels only have sympathetic innervation. And so more sympathetic innervation causes vasoconstriction, and if you decrease sympathetic innervation, that would cause vasodilation. So blood vessels are regulated just by the amount of sympathetic output. For neuroregulation of blood pressure, you have two different reflexes, baroreceptor and chemoreceptor reflexes. Baroreceptors, as we just discussed, tell you how much stretch there is in a blood vessel, which is what indicates your blood pressure. Like when we were talking about systolic pressure, how much are those vessels being stretched? If your blood pressure falls, your baroreceptors aren't stretched as much, and so the rate of impulses that's sent to your cardiovascular center goes down. Your cardiovascular center will increase sympathetic stimulation. In this case, if you have low blood pressure, you increase sympathetic stimulation to cause vasoconstriction and you bring it up. And your cardiovascular center will decrease parasympathetic stimulation to your heart. If blood pressure increases, you have the opposite that occurs. So here is a picture of what your baroreceptor reflex looks like. So you can see some baroreceptors here in your carotid sinus of your carotid artery. Here are some baroreceptors of your aorta. If you have high blood pressure, they get stretched more. If you have low blood pressure, they get stretched less. So all that information goes to your medulla. Here's a slice of your brainstem right here. Cardiovascular center determines what's to be done. So if your blood pressure is too high, then you get parasympathetic stimulation that's sent to your heart saying, whoa, slow down. And that'll help decrease your blood pressure. If your blood pressure is too low, your rate of action potentials from your baroreceptors will be nice and slow. And it will tell your cardiovascular center, we need to bring your blood pressure up. And so you'll send out sympathetic stimulation to your heart and stimulate faster rate of depolarization of your SA node, increasing your heart rate, and you'll also increase the force of contractility. You can also send effectors to your blood vessels to cause vasoconstriction. So this is the baroreceptor reflex. And as all reflexes are, this will occur very, very quickly. So for example, when you are laying down in bed and you're about to get up for the day, you don't normally have to worry about passing out from lack of blood flow to your brain, even though you have a very sudden change in gravity, and that gravity is pulling down on your blood, pulling that away from your brain. Your baroreceptor reflex works very, very quickly to help make sure that you have enough blood pressure to maintain perfusion of your blood in your brain. Here is another schematic of what happens if you have high or low blood pressure. If your blood pressure is elevated, it stretches your arteries. Baroreceptors will increase their rate of action potentials. So it will inhibit your heart, and the way that it does so is by increasing parasympathetic stimulation. Almost all of your parasympathetic outflow comes out of your vagus nerve, so increase vagal tone, which slows down your heart rate and brings down your blood pressure. That baroreceptor information that's telling you you have high blood pressure also inhibits your vasomotor center. So vasomotor is referring to your blood vessels. This reduces sympathetic tone, which means that you are not going to get as much sympathetic innervation to your blood vessels. Reduce your vasomotor tone causes vasodilation, and that will also reduce your blood pressure. The chemoreceptor reflex also works very quickly. It detects a couple of different chemicals in your blood. It detects hypoxia, which is low oxygen levels. It detects if you have hypercapnia, which is high carbon dioxide levels. And it also detects blood pH. And acidosis is if you have a very low pH or a high amount of hydrogen ions in your blood. If you have these factors, low oxygen, high CO2, low pH, this will stimulate sympathetic output. And that causes vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction increases your blood pressure. And the reason why this is important is because vasoconstriction will increase how much circulating blood volume you have moving throughout your body. Most of your blood, while you're at rest, is sitting in your veins. It's called a blood reservoir. If you cause vasoconstriction of these veins, it's going to send more blood back to your heart, which in turn is going to send more blood to your lungs in the pulmonary circuit. And that is where you get rid of excess CO2, and in turn, you can adjust your pH too. You also acquire more oxygen from your lungs. And then you also have, as part of this chemoreceptor reflex, you're going to affect your breathing as well. And so you do have the respiratory aid with that. So you get vasoconstriction if you have too much CO2, too much acid, or not enough oxygen. A more long-term solution to regulating your blood pressure is done through your hormones. And there are a whole host of hormones that can affect your blood pressure. The first couple, you have angiotensin-2 and aldosterone. And so if you remember, angiotensinogen is a plasma protein that normally is just floating through your blood unless you have stimulation to your kidneys to produce renin. Renin will convert that normal angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 gets converted to angiotensin 2 thanks to angiotensin converting enzyme located in your lungs. Angiotensin 2 is a great vasoconstrictor, and so angiotensin 2 will help to increase your blood pressure. Vasoconstriction always increases blood pressure. If you think about if you have a garden hose and you slide your finger over the opening of that garden hose, you can get your water to shoot out a lot farther. Versus if you take your finger off, then you still have the same volume of blood that's flowing through, but it's coming through at a much slower rate. Aldosterone affects blood volume, and so it causes you to retain sodium, it causes you to retain water. And if you increase your blood volume, you'll increase your blood pressure. So angiotensin 2 and aldosterone will both increase blood pressure. And this picture is kind of a reminder. You're not going to get renin release unless you're stimulated through one of these factors. If you're dehydrated, so low blood volume, if you're deficient in sodium, if you have a hemorrhage going on, uncontrolled bleeding, that causes a decrease in blood volume, which leads to a decrease in blood pressure. And that is how you'll get renin release. So anything that downstream from that renin release caused by low blood pressure will cause an increase in that blood pressure. So angiotensin 2 will help fix it and bring that blood pressure up, as will aldosterone. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are released from the adrenal medulla, and they're released due to sympathetic stimulation, and these can affect your heart rate and also contractility. And so they increase cardiac output, they'll increase blood pressure as well. Antidiuretic hormone used to be called vasopressin. Its main function is that it causes water retention, and so causes you to maintain water volume and maintain blood pressure, bring it up, and it also, more minimally, but it causes vasoconstriction, and vasoconstriction increases your blood pressure. So far, everything we've talked about increases blood pressure. Finally, the natriuretic peptides, and a good example of this one is Atrial natriuretic peptide. This is a hormone released by the cells of the atria in your heart, and they detect when they are stretched because of increased blood volume. They cause vasodilation. The ANP causes vasodilation, and it also affects your kidneys, causing you to lose more salt and lose more water. And so it's causing you to lose more blood volume. And by lowering your blood volume, it helps to lower your blood pressure. So atrial natriuretic peptide will lower your blood pressure. Finally, there are some local ways that you can regulate your blood pressure a little bit more regionally. And so that's called autoregulation. Auto means self. These are very fast and just very local, very regional adjustments. And so you see this when you exercise, for example. You're going to direct more blood flow toward your skeletal muscles that you're using to exercise and less blood flow toward your digestive system, for example. You can also affect regional blood flow in the brain and direct blood to areas of the brain that are being used more. And there's also a difference in the pulmonary and the systemic circuit response when you have low oxygen levels. And I'll come back and talk about that in a second. There's also physical changes. If you have temperature changes, you may notice if you're playing outside or exercising and you get really hot, you look really flushed perhaps, and that is because the vessels in your extremities are dilating in order to let that heat out of your body. Compared to when it's cold, your extremities may feel cold as well because you're saving that blood and that warmth for your core and your organs that need it. There's also a myogenic response. As your blood vessels stretch to accommodate a larger volume of blood, they will automatically contract. So that smooth muscle will contract if it stretches due to a high blood volume. And there's also plenty of local vasodilators and vasoconstrictors. Nitric oxide, for example, is a local vasodilator that will act in one area, but not throughout the entire body. So going back to that systemic and pulmonary autoregulation difference, there's a difference because you have different purposes for the blood flowing through those circuits. If you have blood flowing through the pulmonary circuit, the whole purpose is to pick up oxygen into the blood and drop off carbon dioxide. If you're in the systemic circuit, you need to drop off the oxygen to those body cells that need it to generate ATP, and you need to pick up carbon dioxide into the blood. So there's a difference in how these vessels will act if you have hypoxemia, if you have low oxygen. In systemic vessels, so everywhere except your lungs, in systemic blood vessels, if you have hypoxemia, you have dilation of blood. If you think about it from a logical point of view, blood is flowing through your arteries. It comes to an area of your body that is very busy. You have a lot of metabolic processes going on. Your cells are consuming a lot of oxygen. Your red blood cells don't need that oxygen. They generate their ATP through anaerobic respiration. You need to deliver more oxygen to those tissues that really need it. So you have dilation of those blood vessel walls to promote flow and increase how much oxygen you can deliver to those body cells. However, if you are in the lungs, the pulmonary circuit, the whole purpose of the blood flowing through that region is to load oxygen into the blood. If you come to an area of the lung that has poor oxygen, then you should go and try a different part of the lung. So you actually get constriction of the blood vessels if you have an area with low oxygen in the lungs. And then once you get to an area of the lung that's better ventilated and you have high oxygen, you get dilation of that blood vessel so that you can load a lot more oxygen into the blood. So you have totally opposite responses in the systemic blood vessels and in the pulmonary blood vessels in response to low oxygen levels. Systemic blood vessels will dilate and pulmonary blood vessels will constrict. So you can see there are a lot of different factors that affect your blood pressure. Anything that affects cardiac output can affect blood pressure. If you increase your blood volume, increase how much resistance you have, if you change how much blood is being returned back to the heart, so increased venous return, Your skeletal muscle pumps, as you move, you pump that blood past the valves and move it toward the right atrium. Respiratory pump changes the pressures in your abdomen, in your thorax, and vasoconstriction. All of these will result in moving more blood back to your heart. Vasoconstriction is looking at constricting your veins in order to pull some more blood from that blood reservoir. Your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system can affect blood pressure. They affect your heart rate. They can affect your stroke volume, changing how much resistance you have, basically due to blood vessel length or viscosity or the radius of your blood vessels. That also affects resistance, and all of those things can affect your mean arterial pressure. And then you have many mechanisms that help to make sure that your blood pressure is maintained within proper homeostatic levels.